Moving on to the next story of today, which is in sort of the intersection that I just love, which is about like education and learning and tech. And put in the mix a story from Wired about the use of or schools adopting facial recognition in the name of fighting COVID-19. This article plays out in the state of New Mexico. I actually used to live in New Mexico for 2 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was back in 2001 to 2002 to 2004.
Very cool.
It was a really interesting time. I believe New Mexico was the poorest state in the United States at the time. And there was heavy recruiting from the military to the war with Iraq. So it was a pretty, coming as like a Dane and a Scandinavian, it's a pretty wild experience that I couldn't go to Walmart without like a military person coming up wanting to give me a signing bonus to join the military. It's like, I'm really just here for the ice cream, but thank you very much. No, the moment they find out you're a foreign national, that was pretty like, not an American. And then, then they're not so friendly anymore. But in the state of New Mexico, a Wired investigation has found out that there's pretty widespread use of facial recognition software. And there's a big debate about whether the students have actually given consent to this. So back in June, the school board in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, was facing a series of votes on their budget for the reopening of schools. Basically figuring out how can we go back to school in a safe way and how can we use technology to ensure that people aren't sick when they come to school, that they're sitting fairly spread out, all of these things. And I guess like their thinking was that they don't want to put the administrator at risk. Because if the school staff has to take everyone's temperature, you have to get pretty close to them. And I guess it also takes some time to get them in and out, or into the school, not out of the school. So the thinking was that, they bought all these screens by a company called OneScreen. And they released a new smart, so with COVID, they pivoted. And they released a new technology they called GoSafe, which is a technology that scans your forehead for your temperature as you're entering the school. So you can put it out like at the entrance of the school in all the classrooms so you could see if a person gets a temperature or if they're wearing a face mask while at school. But one of the actual selling points has been that they use facial recognition to be able to detect who the student are. So let's say there's a student, that student develops a temperature while at school. It won't just like light up and say in classroom B, there's a student with a temperature. It will like be able to detect what student it is, which I think is wow. That goes pretty far. So they'll be able to detect that, but they also, as they say, can detect if unauthorized persons make it into the class. Meaning that, of course, if I use facial recognition and I know there are 225 students here and all of a sudden there's like 2 extra people, maybe with guns, I would presume that's a part of the value proposition as well for a school, then they can say, oh, there's unsanctioned persons on campus. And what they actually used at OneScreen to sell GoSafe is also a value proposition saying that this tech won't be outdated once there's a vaccine, because you can do other stuff with it, like take attendance and figure out if there are, like safety things, like there are unsanctioned persons on the campus or in the classroom. So they're actively using it as a selling point. But of course, and this is one of the school board members has come on the record. She's one of the people that reported it. Her name is Catherine Cullen. And she said, particularly as it pertains to student privacy, civil liberties, storing and securing data, it made her feel uncomfortable. And of course, this isn't Europe, because then because of GDPR, it wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
I looked into the use of facial recognition 3 years ago, just to be very updated about how tech was moving, and it was a total no-go. One of the only examples you could find, other than like China, was actually Israel, where several Israeli schools have reported using facial recognition in schools for safety purposes. But other than that, I had a client actually from Lithuania asked me to look into it a year ago. that wanted to use it in their schools. And my clear answer was that that I find it extremely unethical. And while we might go in that direction in the future of relying on facial recognition and micro expressions to target teaching, that is something that to me requires explicit consent, and within at least a European framework is not legal.
And it should be like that.
Exactly. I mean, I think, of course, when you tie in a value proposition of something like this to a security perspective, people become irrational. I remember the first time I was bringing my family to Peru. So we acquired a Peruvian publishing startup called Yo Publico and brought it into the CanopyLAB family. And I remember that all of my friends said, you're bringing your family to one of the most dangerous countries in the world. It's famous for kidnapping. And of course, I went home and I Googled it. I was like, oh my God, I'm such an irresponsible parent. But first of all, that's not really true. Peru, I'm not going to say it's safe, but there are definitely areas of Peru that are safe. And if you use particular guidelines in your behavior, you're going to be just fine being in Peru. But I totally went down the rabbit hole. I was researching wearables and injecting trackers into my kids. And first of all, I think there are some wearable trackers also for kids, not very small kids. But I think when I researched that, it's they're so hackable. That's so do I want to put something on my kid's arm that could then be used for a pedophile to hack into and send them messages and call them? So I think that, and then the idea of actually shooting in a tracker in their body somewhere, you watch it in James Bond, and there it hurts a lot because it's always when it's James Bond, the tracker's this big, it's in his chest or in his arm, and he's dying from having it pulled out. In reality, it's become hugely popular in Sweden and Denmark to have those little tiny ones in your hand, but they're not very smart. You can't store a lot of information on them. Usually they're not really online. So I guess my reasoning was, one, the tech doesn't really work, and also it's such a violation of my child's rights for me to do something like that, as their parent. I think it's yeah. I wouldn't feel like it was okay, but I think this taps into a lot of debates we're having. I remember the first time I had a kid, I told everybody, you can't put pictures of Elliot on social media.
What? Because
he hasn't given consent. And I thought I wouldn't have wanted to grow up and have a public library of all of my faces from, those awkward moments. I think we've all had a couple of years in our teen years where we look pretty terrible, and all of us would like to forget it.
That's the beauty of it.
But I wouldn't have. I mean, I'm one of those people who I've done a deliberate effort of deleting pictures that I don't like. So I don't like the idea of us putting that on people, that they have their whole life digitally stored and published to other people. I even I wasn't baptized until I was a teenager, because my mom believed that she couldn't make a decision about religion on behalf of another person. So I think that's sort of the tradition that I've been brought up in. But then the problem is that when you do have kids, and you always think your kid is the most beautiful on earth, which is good that it's designed that way. It means we don't toss them out,
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden it's hard not to do it. So you end up doing it, anyways. But putting in facial recognition at schools under a pretext of just doing it for COVID-19 reasons, that is a far stretch. And I think we'll definitely see, it was called, there was a professor of public policy at the University of Michigan called Shobita Paratahui.
And she just butchered his name.
Yes, but actually called it a Trojan horse. So to me, this is it's a complete Trojan horse. We see it across the board with COVID-19, trying to force vaccinations. I'm not trying to jump on the bandwagon of people saying people are forcing vaccinations. It's just some of the ideas that have been floated about forcing vaccinations, forcing specific types of behavior, forcing you to wear a face mask, forcing you to subject yourself to facial recognition. While I think the mask makes sense, and even though there's divided opinions on that, I don't think that's a violation of your human rights. But I view it as a violation of your human rights that someone puts in facial recognition at a school without my consent or a consent of a parent.
Yeah, this whole thing sounds like a scary sci-fi movie. A pandemic came, killed millions. Governments went crazy. We started monitoring our own kids. Vaccines were mandatory and like whatnot. It's like all
Yeah,
the
and then
scary shit from
they
movies. It's
banned
in one.
alcohol. You
Yeah.
know, like in Denmark and I think in Finland too, they banned selling alcohol after 10 p.m. So it's like the narrative is, okay, so people get drunk so much that they can't plan their drunkenness. So if we ban alcohol sales after 10 p.m., then we can actually control the population from doing fucked up things. But I think so my initial reaction was, that's not going to work. I know I got a wine stash for about a year at home. So you can ban the sales after 10 p.m. all you want. I'm not likely to go out at that time anyways. But we do see it works. It works with the younger crowds. It works with the teens. So generally, like alcohol sales has gone considerably down.